also has this statement, which is a really weird statement when you think about it. If you don't have a sword, sell it, your garment, which is really important, and buy a sword. So there's part of the church that is a pacifist part. Now, not generally here. You may be here and you may be a pacifist. It seems to be in the Anglican Church, the Orthodox Church, maybe parts of the Catholic Church has pacifism, that a Christian is never to do any kind of violence. Violence is never justified by a Christian. And the question is it? And what was Jesus saying here when he said buy a sword? Now, a pacifist will often argue this passage, and they'll say a couple of things. They'll say, well, Jesus was not trying to make a revolt. That's why he didn't tell them, go get your sword so you can revolt. In other words, they're building a straw man they can easily tear down, saying that we who believe, and you kind of understand my view now, that there are rare times that are very nuanced where we use violence as Christians. It will happen to some of us. We will have to use it. They'll say to us, well, Jesus wasn't trying to get a revolt. Well, I never said he was. So you're arguing against a fake argument. It's a straw man. Jesus, we know he wasn't trying to get a revolt. He was just telling them, you guys are going to go on the road now. You're going to need some self-protection. If somebody attacks you, you got a sword there, you're able to protect yourself. That's what he was telling them. That's what I believe he was telling them. And somebody else said that Jesus goes on to say, he will be numbered among the transgressors. He's quoting Isaiah 53. And someone else said, well, what Jesus was doing here was telling the disciples to get swords so that they would be transgressors. In other words, in his pacifistic view, he said that anybody that has a sword would have been a transgressor. And so Jesus then would be numbered among the transgressors because he told them to get swords. Once they got swords, now they're transgressors. So that would be a fulfillment of the passage. And I listen to it and I go, wow, that is really dancing around to defend your position, to try to explain away a passage. That's really dancing around it. First of all, the Bible says that no one can say when they are tempted by God. And if Jesus said, get a sword, and by that they were sinning, now Jesus would have told them to sin. It can't be the case. They're trying to explain away why Jesus would say, get a sword. He's telling them, just as you have to provide in this new environment, you're going to have to protect yourself. Now let's talk about this a little bit, because I think it's important for us to have this defense. Is it okay for a Christian to ever use violence? What about when someone breaks into your home and threatens your life? What about when someone breaks into your home and threatens your property? Is it okay to be a soldier? Can you be a soldier? Can you be in another country? And can you shoot someone in that other country as a Christian? Can you be a police officer who may get into a gunfight and have to take the life of someone? Are these things justifiable according to the scriptures? Well, Exodus 22, 2 and 3 helps us with this idea. I know I'm already hearing the objections to using Exodus. That's the law. You're using the law to justify what you're saying. I'm going to the spirit of the law here. I'm not saying that we're under this law. I'm simply saying this is a theocracy, and God has an understanding of nuance. This is a very nuanced topic. On one side, you have people who will say, you should never, ever be violent as a Christian. You should always be a pacifist. On the other side, you got some, evangelical with 20 guns in his house, and he's like, come into my house, you better be right with Jesus, because I'm going to send you to your maker. I'll take you down. So it's nuance between those two, all right? And I want to show you from this first verse the nuance that God has. Listen to it. It's Exodus 22, 2 and 3. If a thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. So if a thief is breaking into your house, you strike him and he dies, then, hey, he shouldn't have been there. However, there is nuance. If the thief is found breaking in and he is struck and dies, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. Now, we're not talking about a murderer. We're not talking about a raper. We're talking about a thief. So if a thief breaks into your house at night, because it's nuanced, you don't know why he's there, you don't know who's there, and you get up to protect your family and you strike him and he dies, there's no bloodshed. Even though he was there to steal something, maybe he had your toaster and was heading out the door, and you whacked him, and you just in your confusion. But in the daytime, you'd be able to see the toaster under his arm to see that he was leaving. So you would be held responsible. Now, this isn't different than our time. In our time, if someone breaks into your house and they're stealing something and they're heading for the door and you shoot them as they're going out the door, then you're probably going to be prosecuted for that, and a jury is going to have to determine the nuance. God was determined in the law, but he said, so we've got to have nuance in what we're doing. You can defend your life, but you can't defend your toaster. That's my toaster. You shouldn't have stolen it, right? So that's what's happening here. And then he says, going back to the thief, he should make full restitution. He's got to make restitution for what he took, which for them meant if you stole something, you had to repay fourfold. There's a penalty to it. And if he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. They didn't have prisons in their day, so when you stole something, then you were sold as a person into slavery. And this is where you find slavery in the Old Testament, and there's more to it than this, and we'll cover it in a study at some point, but it was not antebellum slavery. People will look at the Old Testament, see slavery there, and go, this is antebellum slavery. No, antebellum slavery was a particularly horrible type of slavery. And it wasn't just in antebellum, it wasn't just in the South. It was all over the world at a certain point. England stopped slavery before we did, but it was all over the world, and that particular kidnapping, slavery, was brutal, and that's not what we find in the Old Testament. In fact, there were a lot of protections towards the slaves that you could become if you were caught stealing and didn't have anything to repay for it. Now, self-defense, especially deadly force, is to be used carefully and thoughtfully. This also gives us some thoughts on the difference between life and property. And even if someone comes in to take your life, and you don't have to take their life, you don't take their life just because you can take it. In other words, if you get the drop on them, you don't have to shoot them, right? It's not like, you know what, you're in a place you shouldn't have been, buddy. I've been waiting for an opportunity to use my 40 cal, and here it comes. 20 cal, 40 cal, got 40 cal. Don't want to sound like I don't know what I'm talking about. Nehemiah 4:14 is a very interesting case. Again, this is the law, and they're sent to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They're not sent back to the land of Israel to fight. They're sent to rebuild the walls. But they're attacked by the people that live there now. They don't want them to rebuild it. There's enemies that are there. And so Nehemiah has to address this. He tells them, build the wall with your trowel in one hand and your sword in the other. But that's not the passage I want to read to you. Here, listen to what Nehemiah says to them. And I looked, and I arose, said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the people, do not be afraid of them. These people that are attacking you, don't be afraid of them. Remember, the Lord is great and awesome. He's our first sense of protection all the time, right? And fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. So they had a responsibility to make sure that their brethren, their wives, their children, their houses were safe. And I think that applies, not because it's not under the law. He's telling them in a certain situation, you're being attacked, you've got a job to do. Now defend yourself and your family in the midst of that. That self-defense is okay. Now, self-defense is not petty. And the verse that people will use is turn the other cheek. Here's what the passage says. This is Matthew 5:39 through 41. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. So that's what the pacifist will quote. Don't resist an evil person. You're telling me that if somebody breaks into my house and wants to rape my wife, I'm not supposed to resist an evil person. She's in the back room. Go ahead. I'm just doing what Jesus told me to do. I don't think that's what he's saying. He says, don't resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other hand to him. This is more persecution. This is more an insult. Your self-defense is not to be petty. If someone is physically attacking you with insults and slaps, that's one thing. If somebody pulls out a bat to bash in the side of your head, you don't turn to the other side of your head. That's not what it's saying. But you don't want to be petty. This is the extreme. There's no other option. There's no other out. This is what has to be done. He goes on to say, if they want to take your tunic, give them your cloak also, and whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. This is in a particular world where the Romans had the right, a Roman soldier had the right to apprehend people's property for themselves to use if they needed it. And so he says, don't do that. But don't use that verse to say you can't have self-defense, because that's petty. It's a slap. It's not attacking the person. In Acts 22, Paul defends himself. He doesn't defend himself physically, but he defends himself. He's going to be scourged. And that's 39 stripes with a cat of 9 tails. Paul don't want that. He's been scourged before. He's been beaten with rods. He don't want it. So Paul says, well, it says here in Acts 22, 25 and 26, and as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? He knew that was against the law. You couldn't scourge an uncondemned Roman. And when the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, take care what you do. This man is a Roman. So Paul wasn't willing just to go through something. He was willing to defend himself, even though at this point it's saying, I've got the rights here. As a Roman, he defended himself. Now, what about, this is the other thing people will say, well, what about Peter pulling out the sword and Jesus saying, put your sword away, Peter. All who are going to live by the sword will die by the sword. That certainly tells us we shouldn't be using a weapon in any way, because he told Peter to put away the sword. But let's go back to the context. Jesus is being arrested. When you are arrested, if you pull out a gun, you are going to die. That's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is being arrested. Peter pulls out his sword. He doesn't go after a soldier because he probably can't take him because he's a fisherman, but he sees this servant of the high priest. He's like, tries to get his head and gets his ear instead. And Jesus says, put the sword away, for all who live by the sword die by the sword. The all that's there when Jesus says that, and this is Matthew 26:52. Let me just read it so you can get the words of Jesus. But Jesus said to him, put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. He's not saying anyone who defends themselves will perish by it, but when you are being arrested, put your sword away. You kill this guy, they're going to execute you, Peter, is what he's saying. This is not the time to use the sword. I told you to get a sword earlier. This is not the time. So to use that as a verse to say we should be pacifist is not a good verse to use. What about being in the armed forces or being a police officer? Is that okay for a Christian to do? What about when you have to shoot someone? Some of you guys have been in the armed forces, and you've had to take someone's life. Some of you guys have been on the police force and maybe had to pull your gun and had to make a decision on whether or not you would take someone's life. Well, Romans chapter 13 deals with this, where it talks about the soldier, the peacekeeper, being one of God's ministers, and that we are supposed to obey them, obey the laws of the land, it says. So if you're living in a state that allows you to carry a gun, you can carry a gun. If you're living in a state that doesn't allow you to carry a gun, you got to obey the law of the land. And you say, well, I don't like that. It makes me vulnerable. Then move to another state. That's what everybody's doing. They're moving to Texas, right? Yeah, so, we obey the law of the land. But talking about the peacekeepers, the soldiers, God says this in Romans 13:4. For he is God's minister. The word minister is servant. For he is God's servant to do good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. So God allows this servant of his to have a sword, and he doesn't bear it in vain, meaning he uses that sword to be able to keep the peace and protect them. And it's okay. He goes on to say, for he is God's minister, again, an avenger to execute wrath on he who practices evil. So we need to have police officers and soldiers who will take up the sword to be able to defend our nation or to defend our city. And those who practice evil will have to contend with them. Now, as someone in the Army, you may be given a command you don't agree with. That may happen as a police officer as well. And you may have to make a decision. I'm not doing this. And if you do that, you'll probably pay a price by disobeying the order. But you have the right to say, I object to this. I don't think it's right. You don't have to do it. And as a soldier, you might find yourself in a situation like that. And if you are, then you've just got to end up doing what's right. You've got to do what's right overall. But it is okay to be in the armed forces. I get this question a lot. What about a police officer? What about, who killed somebody? What about a soldier who did? Well, if they're defending our nation, then it's okay for them to be there. And I realize a lot of soldiers carry a lot of guilt with them after they do kill someone, probably police officers as well. And the Bible does make provisions for that. Now, just a couple more things. I'm done with this section, and I'm out of time, which, I should have taken these 4 verses in 2 studies. Ezekiel 33:6 talks about the watchman on the wall. This is an analogy that you and I have responsibility for the souls of people that are around us. We need to warn people that there is a hell, there is a separation from God, and if you don't come to Christ, you will go there. And this is the analogy. He says, but if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people were not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he has taken away an iniquity, but his blood will be required of the watchman. So the watchman's watching, somebody comes in with the sword, he doesn't blow the trumpet, somebody's killed by that person coming in with the sword that killed them by iniquity, but the watchman has responsibility. This tells us and helps us to understand the Good Samaritan law. And there are Good Samaritan laws now, because there have been people who stood by while other people were attacked. There's a passage in Psalms 82:4 that says, deliver the poor and needy, free them from the hand of the wicked. So if you are standing on a street corner and somebody attacks a woman right in front of you, depending on your skills, you have some responsibility. At least you could scream and holler and get some attention to it. If you're an MMA fighter, then go to town. Take care of the guy. And I say that because of a viral video where a UFC guy, there was a guy attacking another guy, and the UFC guy went in, boom, and it was like, got him on the ground and pinned him, and there it was. It was all said and done. Somebody came, do you need help? He's like, no, I'm good. I don't need help. So we do have responsibility to defend the weak, to defend them from the wicked. And if something is happening, I'm not saying that, if you're a 95-year-old gal that you got to get in there and grapple with the person. But I am saying that screaming and hollering and yelling to be able to at least do something is part of our responsibility. So the summary of all of this is, yes, it is appropriate at times for a Christian to use violence, but it is rare and it is nuanced.